My name is Otterbein. I was drafted into the U.S. Army. I spent 6 years in the U.S. Army. I was stationed at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, and shipped overseas to South Korea. I spent 16 months in South Korea, was extended twice, got back to California, got extended again, shipped down to Fort Eustis, Virginia, and spent the rest of the time, 6 years in service there, got discharged at Fort Eustis. While I was in South Korea, we had what we call a 90-day wonder lieutenant come into the camp. And my job, I worked in supply, drove tanks and APCs and whatever. I had a mess trailer hooked behind the APC going down the riverbed, going out to bivouac. I'd been through there before, and this lieutenant was riding with me. There's a ridge road over the top of it. And I told the lieutenant, I said, this trailer I'm pulling won't go through there. He said, it will go through there. He said, give us a gun and go. I did that, and the top of the trailer came off, and I just looked at him, and he shook his head, and he said, keep going, I'll take care of it. So he didn't try to go through there again, but that's what we called a 90-day wonder.
Art Mitchell served in the United States Army and the Virginia Army National Guard, and I was able to get the rank of Sergeant E5. When I got out of high school, I was interested. I wanted to go to college, but then I realized I'd probably be drafted in the military, so I joined the Virginia Army National Guard, and I was stationed at the National Guard Army in Stanton, Virginia. But then about 6 months after that, I went on active duty to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and I served in the infantry and the artillery with emphasis on radio and wire communication. After there, I stayed at Fort Knox and went and served in the artillery. Now, after that, after I got out off active duty, I served at the headquarters company in Roanoke, Virginia, and then Winchester unit. I served a total of 7 years. Now, some of the highlights that I would say, I haven't served in the military. I drove. I was a Jeep driver as well, and I drove for the major, who was an Army chaplain, and we would go out into the field and on Sunday, and we'd set up a worship service for the units, and so I did that quite a few times, and so sometime later, an officer got in touch with me one day and said, I want to see you in my office, and that's a little scary when an officer wants to see a enlisted man. So, to my surprise, he said, I want you to considering going in as a candidate for officer candidate school. And I said, why me, sir? And he said, I feel that you'd make a good officer. I said, well, thank you, sir. He said, what would be your specialty? And I said, sir, I'd like to be an Army chaplain. He said, they got openings, and I can get you in. But I had decided by that time I wanted to come back and attend Virginia Tech. And so when I got out of the service, I continued in the Army National Guard. And then one area that I consider to be a highlight was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who also became President of the United States. I had the opportunity of serving as a color guard in Virginia Army National Guard, and we welcomed him at the airport. And of course, we were spitting polish and standing at attention. And I remember distinctly, he got off the plane and he said, gentlemen, right now, we're not in the Army. And he shook our hands and stood there and talked with us, and considered that to be a highlight. Very seldom we get a chance to talk to a high-ranking general, and also have the chance of meeting the President of the United States. Now I want to say that I'm very proud to serve in the United States Army and the Virginia Army National Guard, to serve my country. Of course, I served during peacetime, but I want to say that I'm proud to be an American.
Bill Pollard. I served in the United States Navy and the United States Navy Reserve for 22 years. Most of my duty was stateside. All of it was stateside. And I served a couple of weeks at the Pentagon on a reserve duty, and that was interesting. And then my last tour of duty, I was on a big ship that went up in the St. Lawrence Seaway and then up into the Great Lakes. And we stopped at various spots along the Great Lakes and tied up the ship and invited the people in that area to come on board and tour the ship. We also had the Marines on board, and they had all their equipment down in the lower part of the ship, and the folks that came on board could tour that as well.
I'm Bob Hansbrough. I joined the Air Force in 1957 with basic training in San Antonio, Texas, Lackland Air Force Base. I was then sent to New Jersey to McGuire Air Force Base, and later on I spent 2.5 years in France at Dreux Air Base south of Paris. And I was discharged in 1961. I was in the Air Police. Charles de Gaulle was the president of France when I was in France. And he had an uprising in his generals who were either in Morocco or Algeria, which at that point in time, they were satellite countries, but they were still under the French domain. And his generals, either in Algeria or Morocco, they had an uprising. And our base, where I was stationed, Dreux Air Base south of Paris, we were the closest airfield to Paris. And they had blocked our runways with vehicles and planes and all kinds of trucks and tractors and this type of thing, not knowing or not even realizing that maybe, just maybe, those generals would come into France and depose Charles de Gaulle. He wasn't elected, I don't think. He was just a king. I'm not really sure how their politics worked, but that was probably the most exciting thing that happened to me during my tenure in the Air Force, because we had a complete French army camped around my Air Force Base. But I was in security and base patrol. I investigated accidents off base. I had to go into Paris at various times as a policeman to pick up prisoners and escort them back to the base. Just the general police duties that a person would have if you were in the Air Police.
I'm Ritchie. I served in the U.S. Army from 1967 to 1970 as a finance specialist. My job in the Army was a payroll clerk. I served 14 months in Korea, which was a very enjoyable time.
I'm Charles S. Geil. I was in the U.S. Army from 1951 to 1953. Well, I found out couple things. I didn't know there was so much water in the Pacific Ocean as when I went over. 16 days I didn't see land. And I got my rifles and stuff in Yokohama, put us back on the ship and took us around up the Yellow Sea to Incheon and told us we was going to hit a typhoon. And I come from a religious family, but I prayed to the Lord that night He wouldn't let me drop in the bottom of the Yellow Sea. And I prayed a lot in Korea. I had some close calls, but I come home safe, and I still pray a lot.
Hello, I'm Cliff Davis. I served in the United States Navy from February 1952 until January 1956. Nearly every bit of my time was aboard a destroyer, United States William M. Wood, a destroyer picket ship which served in the Atlantic Sixth Fleet. Our job was to operate about 6 miles out from the carrier group to search for enemy submarines or enemy aircraft. So that's a little bit about my naval career as such. I had a lot of fun in the Navy. We spent most of our time in the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean. We went to the Caribbean a number of times, and to the Mediterranean a number of times. We took one midshipman cruise in 1953 and went to Northern Europe with about 60 midshipmen from the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. We left most of our crew ashore and brought the midshipmen aboard to do the jobs that normally our crew would do. We had a lot of fun. We were in Volos, Greece for a short stop, and just as we were leaving Volos to go to another port of entry, there was an earthquake, and we turned around, went back into the port, and stayed for a week. Sent our search and rescue crews ashore to help with the victims of the earthquake. We brought orphans from the orphanage which had been destroyed aboard the ship and kept them for 4 or 5 days, gave them a place to sleep and fed them. And it was an interesting voyage.
My name is Frederick J. Hopkins. I was in the United States Army, the infantry in the early 1950s. I enjoyed the service. There was a bunch of good men there. They were young men, and they were delicious. They were hard-working guys, and we went through the training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. They were very, very wonderful boys, and I'm sorry to see some of them go. I don't have much of a story to tell, but I did enjoy the service, and the men that didn't come back, they were the true heroes. The true heroes of the men didn't come back, or the men that came back wounded, and so forth. But we all are heroes, and we're all veterans. Thank you very much, Adam.
My name's Harold Grimm. I served in the Army in 65 and 66, and it was in the Signal Corps. The best part of the whole thing was I got to travel around. I never traveled before, and got to travel across the United States because I started in California and ended up in Georgia and then ended up in Texas. So I got to travel with the Army. In other words, like I said, the first time I'd ever traveled in my life, in other words.
My name is John Widener. I am a former member of the U.S. Navy Naval Reserves, and I was in the reserve for 12 years. One of those was active duty, but when I retired from the reserves, it was after 12 years of service. During my 12 years of reserve duty, one year our squadron was called up on active duty to fly out of Guantanamo, Cuba, to record any of those missiles that were being hauled into Cuba from Russia. And we found one big target about 100 miles away and zeroed in on that. And come to find out it was one of the Liberty ships that we gave Russia after the end of the war. And that Liberty ship was towing a destroyer that we had given to Cuba after the Second World War. And we did what they call rigging. In other words, you got to take all kinds of pictures. Some from below, where you're taking pictures up under the canisters that were holding the missiles, and just getting all kinds of pictures. In fact, we got so many pictures, and we rigged that shipping arrangement for so long that on Monday morning, the representatives at the UN registered a complaint about harassment on the high sea. However, we really didn't harass them. We were just getting all the information that we felt like we needed. And we flew all over the Mediterranean, taking pictures of all kinds of ships, cargo ships, anything and everything up and down the East Coast. And one of our crews actually picked up this periscope of a Russian submarine, and it was a nuclear sub. Never did come up on the surface, but they chased that nuclear sub from Russia all up and down the East Coast for about 5 days before we finally gave up and took off back to Russia. But we had any number of experiences. Being stationed at Guantanamo was not the nicest place to be, but it was okay. They fed you good. That was one of the main things they kept you quiet with, was good food in the Navy. And one thing I liked about the reserves, at nighttime, unless we were out on patrol, we always had a nice warm bunk to go back to and take a shower and get in the bunk and get a good, nice rest. But it was an interesting 12 years. Every summer we took off for a 2-week training cruise, different places around the world. We went to Spain, Morocco, and of course down in Florida, a couple of the naval air bases down there. And that's where we would operate out of. And got some good training. Of course, that aircraft that we used back then, the P-2V, is no longer in use by the U.S. Navy. I think they gave all those planes to Brazil. But the Navy now is using what they call the P-3V, a much faster plane. It's got 4 engines, 4 turboprop engines instead of what we had with the Neptune were 2 reciprocating engines and 2 jet engines. If we ever found a target that we wanted to chase down, they would turn on the jets and we could fly pretty fast. However, when they found a target and needed to slow down, and of course they shut down the jets and just patrolled on the reciprocating engine. But it was very, very interesting 12 years, I can say. But in a lot of cases, it's just the usual military situation. Hurry up and wait. We get out on the flight line and wait for the pilot, co-pilot, and navigator to come down, and we'd have everything gassed up and untied and ready to leave. And sometimes we'd go out and we'd have a definite destination that we'd have to go to, like we flew into Panama one time for some business. And other times we would go out on patrol and we might not be back for 12, 14 hours. And that gets kind of boring, but all in all, it was a very interesting experience for me.
Hi, I'm Larry Clark, and I'm a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. And I went in the Air Force shortly after high school and stayed there for 21 years. So it's been a very long and very important part of my life. And why did I go in the Air Force? One answer to that is I'm not really sure, but I remember from my childhood days, for some reason I wanted to go in the military and specifically the Air Force. And I don't think I'd ever seen an airplane at that time. And but since then, and especially in the last few years, I've done a lot of research into my family history, and got enough that I published this book about a year ago. It's called My Family and the Wars of America. And I've identified over 200 ancestors who served in wars of America, from French and Indian all the way up till now. And that probably had a big influence on me, because growing up, I hardly knew an adult in my family, who hadn't served in the military. and many of them in World War II when I was very young. And I guess makes me think I came from a warlike family, and so that's why I went in the military. And anyway, doing this and moving here to Harrisonburg and living in a Mennonite dominant community has given me a lot of time to think. I've come into contact with people who teach at EMU in the Peace Department. I have a good friend who also served in Vietnam and who's a Mennonite, and he served as a conscientious objector during the war. And so we've had some very, interesting discussions. And the Vietnam time was one of the more interesting times, of course, for me. My wife stayed home with our 3 young boys during my year in Vietnam. And at the time, I missed them terribly. I didn't have any feelings of guilt being away from them for a year. Now, as I grow older, I remember that time with some guilt, thoughts. And I also have time to look back on the Vietnam War and, analyze it. While at the time, I wasn't supposed to analyze it. Serving as a military person during the war, you're there to defeat the enemy. So you don't have time, nor should you spend time analyzing the war. But it was a very important time in my life, and I'm not asked about it too often because, for the most part, people don't want to hear your war stories. And just as I don't particularly want to hear anybody else's war stories, so it's a story that, for the most part, stays inside of you. And you have conversations with yourself about it, but rarely with anybody else. And that's about it.
I'm Mike Snoddy. I was in the United States Navy, and I did one tour of duty in Vietnam. We had just got back from a mini cruise in Norfolk, and I decided that time to get my wisdom teeth pulled out because they had a lot of trouble with them. So knew we wasn't going anywhere, so went to the base hospital and got the teeth pulled. They gave me a 72-hour bunk pass, which means you don't have to do anything for 72 hours. That night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, 0300 for the military personnel, I got roused out of my bunk and said, we're lighting off. And I said, I got a 72-hour pass. I said, not now. I said, we're doing a sortie to the Caribbean. And came to find out we were sortied to protect a Puerto Rican merchant ship from Pirates of the Caribbean, which at the time didn't seem as significant as it does now. But we home based in Guantanamo Bay or Gitmo Bay while we escorted the Puerto Rican merchant ship back and forth so they wouldn't get captured.
Hi, my name's Ned Hillyard. I spent 6 years in the U.S. Army. I was extremely fortunate because I served in the 60s, which was peacetime. So most of my training and assignments, all of them, were stateside. My job in the Army was pretty cool. I became company supply sergeant. Now, when we were in training, the troops were in the field doing training and war games and all that kind of thing in 100 degrees. I was in the supply room. Now, the supply room contained all the equipment and things that GIs needed, but it also contained all the weapons and ammunition, which had to be climate controlled. So while the guys were out in the field, I was in 72 degrees. Worked out well. Looking back on it, it was a good experience. I just graduated from college when I went in, and I learned a lot about life. I learned how to appreciate the need for daily good routine. I learned discipline. I learned independence. And mainly I've made a lot of lifelong friends. That's my fondest remembrance of my time in the service. And as we always say, beat Navy.
My name is Paul Swartz. I served in the Navy in the South Pacific. I went in 1944, came out in 47, and we had a wonderful time. We was on top of the water and we was under the water. The best story I can tell about the Navy is we had liberty in Australia, Japan, China, and the Philippines. And we had a wonderful time. But our captain was he was a school teacher, and he wanted to get this thing over with. And we did.
I'm Ralph Sebrell, and I served in the Navy, in the United States Navy in World War II, both in the Seabees and the regular fleet. I really loved the Navy, and I do to this day. And a little story, if I may, a short one. I got in the Navy coming back from Stanton Military Academy. I got back to Ohio, and I was being drafted already. And I went to Cleveland to meet with 3 officers, 1 Navy, 1 Marine, and 1 Army. And they were to interview as where they were going to send me. And they got talking, and the Army guy said, I want this guy. He said, we really need more men right now. And I said, oh, I wanted to be in the Navy. When I was a little kid, my mother had a little boat for me when I would take a bath. And she would play with that boat with me. And I always wanted to be in the Navy. And can't you do something about that? And this Marine said, well, you'll be a sergeant, and immediately with us, you wouldn't even really go through boot camp. The Army guy said, you'll be a master sergeant with that background you got. And the Navy guy says, gee, I know I can't take any more guys today. I can only take 2 or 3 tomorrow. But let me have this guy. And the Marine said, well, you've been a sergeant immediately over there, when you went to our camp. But let him go. Let him go. And I was in the Navy then. And I was on my way to Great Lakes Naval Training Station.
I am Benjamin Ray Griffith. I'd served in the Army and the artillery. I was during the Korean War, and went to Camp Atterbury in Indiana. Then from there we went to Fort Carson in Colorado. And I was fortunate enough to stay in the States during my tour service. All right, and when I was in service, my child was born, my older son, Dennis, and we had some complications there. And I think about this a lot, is I caught pneumonia in boot camp, I had to go back through boot camp again and start all over again. And the people that was in the boot camp, I went to the first boot camp I went through, they all were shipped over to Korea. And I would have been shipped over with them if it wouldn't. I always think maybe the Lord had a hand in it, that I caught the pneumonia and didn't get shipped. And I went up, when I go up to D.C., the monument that got up there, they called it the Wall. And I read on the names of all the people I knew, went through boot camp with. And I would probably have been there with them if I would have been shipped out. And the reason I wasn't, my son was born with I won't get in details, but quite a very severe disfiguration. And if that wouldn't have happened, I probably would have still been shipped over maybe. I'm not for sure, but then we went through that, and everything worked out fine. And that was, I never did forget that. I was thankful I had pneumonia twice. And then other than that, it was just regular Army stuff. I worked in supplies, and I was what they call a quartermaster supply. And it was an easy job. That was about it.